equally as good a choice. So I was looking for some, temporary employment, walked by a building and saw a sign where they were advertising for an administrator at their local dispute resolution center. And I applied for that job and I got it. So that all happened within a very short period of time. And that was the point at which I was trained in the mediation process. I was trained in the skills and basically became a mediator. Then I moved back to Salt Lake City, and it just so happened that somebody had created the first mediation programs in the court system, and they were looking for a director of dispute resolution. And somebody from the court had heard about me, I don't know how, and literally reached out and called me and asked me to apply. So you can see it has, in retrospect, I don't think I'm filling in the magical dimension of it. I think it was a little bit like that. And so that's how I ended up in the role that I was in the court systems, which I served in for 5 years. I was the director of dispute resolution. And during that time, I think we created programs in 7 different court levels, from the Supreme Court, Court of Appeals, in the family court, divorce, in the criminal court, victim offender mediation, in the juvenile court, victim offender, and then in child welfare, we also developed a mediation program. So that was just an enormous part of my professional work. And I'll just take a breath there. So that's how I came to it. And then something important happened, and this is a little bit of what I'd like to focus on today in terms of the call, is that it was 20 years ago that I was doing this work. And at that time, we had an initiative where we were looking at gender and justice, and we were also looking at racial and ethnic fairness in the judiciary. It's interesting, as the civil rights movement happened, and these, the women's movement and the racial justice movement, there's a way that we always feel like we're going at that for the first time every time it wells up in culture. But 20 years ago, within the court system, we were doing it then. I see you laughing, Jerry, about that. It's never ending. That's the other takeaways. It's a never ending process. So I was asked to facilitate I was part of the formation of the Racial and Ethnic Fairness Task Force. And I facilitated the original convening in order to help all of our different constituencies come together around the intention and to create the ground rules and the process. And then I also did a lot of focus groups in those conversations. And one of the things that I noticed is that there were these trends in conversation, particularly in relationship to issues like race. And it was really the beginning of me starting to think in terms of a stage model. So I would see people in the room. It didn't matter if they were probation officers or cops, or if they happened to be court clerks, or maybe they were judges, but there was a quality of what I would call denial. As far as they were concerned, there was no problem. We were in the judiciary, it was the criminal justice system, and everything was fine. And then I would see other people who were, activists, or who just saw with their own eyes on a daily basis that things weren't fair, or perhaps they looked at who was represented on death row and saw that people of color were overrepresented for our population, and that got their attention. And those people were pissed, and they were angry, and they were demanding change, and they were very vocal in our meetings. Then I saw other groups of people who were not in denial, who were not angry, but who seemed to be able to acknowledge the problem, but at the same time had made a kind of a peace with it. So as I was going along and kind of noticing these people, what started to come to my mind was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. I started to see the denial. I started to see the anger. I started to see the bargaining. I started to see the people who were more withdrawn, who knew they had to be there but didn't have any energy to offer to the process. And then I saw these amazing people that kind of blew my mind. And they were the people that could speak to all these different stages. They could be activists, they could ask for change, they could make demands, they could relax, they could sit back, they could let other people talk. And I was like, well, who are these people that seem to be able to take every point of view but not be limited by any one of them? And those people really got my attention. They were passionate, but they seemed free. They were contributors, but they weren't obsessed. They could be challenging, but they weren't disrespectful. And I just started to think differently through those conversations. And that was literally when I was introduced to the work of Ken Wilber. And at that point, I started to learn that this ability to take perspectives was actually a hallmark of what we call development, right? That there was more complexity. And I realized also that after being introduced to Ken's work, that as a mediator, whether I was doing a barking dog dispute or a, multi-stakeholder transactional process that had 13 or 14 parties to it, that there was a part of me that had come to the process in a naive way, meaning that I felt like if I just created the right conditions and the right process and made the right kind of relationships, I could get to resolution. And I never really recognized that depending on who you are, developmentally, negotiation is easier or harder precisely because of your ability to identify with others and to take other points of view. So, there used to be a judge in our jurisdiction. He used to say the secret to a good mediation was donuts on the table, which, there's some merit in that. But I also saw how fundamentally naive it was and how certain groups of people, it would just be a pleasure to work with them, and other groups of people or individuals, you would feel like you were pulling teeth the whole time. And that there were even the argument that telling people what to do was actually necessary for certain levels of development. So I want to pause there because multiple perspective taking is a capacity. It's also a practice, and it involves being able to see the different truths of perspectives, but that can sometimes cause anxiety in people because they don't know how to then rank perspectives in terms of value. And they also don't know necessarily how to pick and choose between perspectives. And then finally, how to take a perspective on their own perspective. So that whole set of skills is involved in the mediation process. And we may be more or less good at it, but the more you mediate, the better you get at all those things.